Well, here we are, last week of the Drop the Needle series. It's been so much fun, and I think rewarding too, to explore the Bible in a little bit different way. It's prodded us as preachers to preach in a way that we don't usually. It's encouraged us to get in books of the Bible, whole sections of the Bible that we usually don't even dip a toe into. Today's scripture is a great example. It's from 1 Kings. Now, I went back into my preaching records, and the last and only time that I've ever preached from 1 Kings was more than 10 years ago. So, like I said before, this series has not only been engaging and fun, but it's also been a great way for us to show how we use the Bible. How do we, as a community of faith here at Elizabethtown Church of the Brethren and beyond, think about what we do with the Bible as a book of wisdom? Because like I've said before, we're not literalists, because reading the Bible literally actually gets you in some pretty deep trouble pretty quickly. What we want to do is we want to take a look at the Bible as it is in context. And today is a great example of it. You know, I heard a wise man who's part of this congregation, thank you, John David, once say that we need to be careful when reading Scripture, especially when we proof text things, when we take one verse out, because when we do that, what we're doing is we're using Scripture like the inebriated use a light post. We use it for support rather than illumination. Again, if you only pick and choose which scriptures you use because you like them and give them no context, you are using them like an inebriated person uses a light post for support rather than illumination. What we want to do is use scripture for illumination. Again, today's is a great example. So let's dig right in. You'll see what I'm talking about very quickly. The randomly generated scripture that I was given, the verse, was 1 Kings 6:24. It says this: 5 cubits was the length of one wing of the cherub, and 5 cubits the length of the other wing of the cherub. It was 10 cubits from the tip of one wing to the tip of the other. This is almost like a math lesson. 5 and 5 equals 10, and doesn't really give us a lot of information into what's really going on. If you didn't have any context for this, you might think it was actually a live cherub there that somebody was encountering. But if you look into the context, the verses around it, the chapters around it, the book of the Bible, even 1 Kings and its place in the entire Hebrew Scripture, we begin to get a fuller picture. This is a descriptor of the construction of the very first temple in Jerusalem, what was known as Solomon's temple. Okay, so let's talk about Solomon. If this is Solomon's temple, let's talk about Solomon. What was this guy all about? King Solomon, we know him as the wise one, son of King David, wise and just, overseer of one of the most prosperous eras in Israel's history. He's revered even to this day in Christianity, in Judaism, and in Islam. Not only that, last but not least, he was the builder. He was the one who made it happen for the very first temple. What a hero, right? This guy is awesome. Well, maybe. You know, it's funny how we read, teach, and remember Scripture, isn't it? As is so often the case with these larger-than-life biblical figures, there's another side of the story. I would guess that our Sunday school lessons, and Pam was referring to some of those earlier, I guess our Sunday school lessons have usually only taught us one sort of narrative about our biblical heroes, and that might be all right when we're young, but as we get older, we mature and we are able to see the many facets of these biblical characters. I'll bet we were taught probably 2 things from the life of Solomon in our growing up years. But let's take a look at the whole story. You ready? Solomon was chosen by his father, King David, to succeed him as king. But the road to that seat of authority is literally littered with bodies. And I'll explain what I mean. As King David was breathing his last final words of instruction to his son and his confidants around him, he named just who ought to be dealt with and how. who should be killed and who should be taken care of to the positive sense. In other words, who should be eliminated as a potential rival and, well, who should be bribed along the way. Solomon, eager to be a powerful and mighty king like his father, well, he followed his father's example. And one by one, these rivals were taken care of in both senses of the phrase, even though some of them were family members. But the killing didn't stop with the father's hit list. It extended to whomever the young king saw as in his way. And so in short time, the kingdom was consolidated, he had it all hemmed up, and it was in his grasp. Now, with the kingdom in hand, the young king decided that, well, it might be a good time to worship God because, he was a good God-fearing man, right? And he did what he's supposed to do, what good God-fearing people do, what they're obligated to do. He made the right sacrifices at the right times, and he prayed the right prayers. And so this gets to one of those Sunday school stories. This is what I actually preached on 10 plus years ago. One of the stories that we know about Solomon is this. He was praying the right prayers. It was a lengthy session, Scripture says. He was doing all the right things in worship to God, and he hears God's voice asking him what he wanted. Well, Solomon, in his humility, replies that it would be good for him to have wisdom to rule his people. He had all the power he needed, right? So God not only granted him wisdom, but also the promise of more riches and a successful and long reign on the throne. But one catch, and I'll bet you know what it is. He had to follow God's ways. This is the first story that we hear about Solomon, or that we know about Solomon. The other story, directly related to this, exemplifies Solomon's wisdom. It was when he ingeniously settled this dispute between two women who were claiming the same child, right? You remember that? He proposes that the child be split down the middle, and of course, the true mother rises to the top. Now, these two stories, take nothing away from them, are treasured high points in the Solomon narrative. However, do we turn a blind eye to the rest of Solomon's narrative in order to make heroes, perfect heroes, out of our biblical figures? I hope not. So, what about this shadow side of Solomon? Believe it or not, there's more. There's the scheming and power grabbing. There's the nepotism and familia side. Yes, that's a word. Look it up. I did. This is the man who never lived his life outside of the royal palace. He never knew a hard day's labor. A man who measured himself by his wealth and the number of wives and concubines that he had. And that it was in the hundreds. He was a man who, when not worshiping the gods of wealth and vanity, allowed his wives and consorts to worship their gods and even build their own shrines. A man who, yes, ruled for many years, some of the most prosperous times in Israel's history. But when it all ended, after he died, he left a bitterly divided nation that would split upon his death. How wise was he really? Well, I'll let you be the judge. I got an email from Dr. Chris Bucher. She is a member here, and she teaches Hebrew Bible at Elizabethtown College here right next door. And she said she was really looking forward to the scripture, mostly because it's one from the Hebrew Bible of our Old Testament. And I wrote back to her and I said, well, full disclosure, Chris, I'm going to be pretty hard on King Solomon. Well, she quickly responded back, I think he probably deserves it. There's more to our biblical figures than we often think. So, when we read the rest of the story, I got to admit, it makes me a little bit uncomfortable. But that's sometimes what Scripture does, and does so intentionally. This history of Solomon has not been redacted from the Hebrew Scriptures. It has been left in. And it's been left in for a reason, I believe. Notice that the Bible doesn't ignore the ugly side of Solomon's reign and character. And then we're left with more questions than answers. Here's some of my questions. I wonder if you have some that are similar. Did God reward Solomon with kingship even though he had just cold-bloodedly killed his competitors to the throne, even his very own family members? Is that how God works? Is this a quid pro quo God? Rewarding with riches and wisdom if we just say the right prayers at the right time? Does God gloss over our Monday to Saturday behavior as long as we make the right Sunday sacrifices? Granted, it was different in Solomon's time, different days of the week. If that's the case, no wonder he was motivated to build a temple. Well, this is just the beginning of my questions, but that's the context. And so now let's sort of dig in a little bit more on this verse of the day that describes part of the building of that very first temple. So I did a little bit of research, and here's what the temple might have looked like. This is going to show on the screen. This temple was going to be big. It was going to be huge. It was going to be ornate. You can see in this rendering here how ornate the inside was, how glorious it was, how much it would honor God with its design. There at the front, you can even see the cherubs. Now, the cherubs, we don't know exactly what they looked like. There's a couple of, or there are many actually, of artist renderings out there. But cherubs, what we do know is that they were amalgamations. They were combinations of different animals usually. And so it might be a lion crossed with an eagle, often crossed with a human. Here are a couple of renderings. And in this case, they were going to be big. Again, remember, this was in the 500s. Actually, it was further. It was in the 900s, 1000s BCE. This is a long time ago, before the invention of modern tools. To build something like this was remarkable. So, the temple, it was going to be awesome. It was going to be the best thing that people had ever seen. It was going to be a proclamation of faith. And these cherubim, they were going to guard what was most sacred. These were no chubby cupids. They were going to guard the Ark of the Covenant, where the 10 Commandments were said to dwell. So, the temple would not only be literally monumental, it was also going to theologically and politically change the way that the entire nation and religion looked. It would fundamentally change the way people worshiped. It would concretize Jerusalem's importance as the center of their world. Because what the temple would do is create a permanent place of worship for God. Now, we tend to think about this in a New Testament sense, makes sense, as Christians, where Jesus downplayed the importance of the temple. The temple was destroyed. We don't have a central temple in Christianity. We've gone more to a congregational and scriptural model. But what the temple did was it replaced the tabernacle. And again, you can see here what we think is a rendering, what we think it might have looked like, the tabernacle. The tabernacle was what got the people of God through all those years of wandering, some 400 years of wandering, and then the conquest of the Promised Land. So to move from a structure like a tent with canvas walls to a temple of stone was a very big deal. But again, Scripture doesn't let us off the hook that easily. The temple project was not without its controversies. And I hope Eric's watching, because he'll know that his job as Jason's improv partner is very safe. But this is what Jason and I were trying to get at in the children's story when we were talking about it. Some of the controversies that surrounded the temple. First, it was made with some foreign materials, most notably cedars of Lebanon. So This was Hiram of Tyre. He was the king of that area of the world, and so Solomon needed to create an alliance and a partnership with him so that he could purchase these cedars, which led to some increase in taxes as well. Can't imagine that most people were too happy about that. Next, there was the issue of who actually would oversee the building of such a structure. Now, to undertake a massive project like this, they couldn't go out and get bids from the contractor or the several contractors that were in Jerusalem. What Solomon needed to do was actually conscript. That means not volunteer. Solomon needed to conscript his own Israelite people to do the administrative and the security work, which would, of course, take them away from their families and their livelihoods if they had to put their attention towards that. But worse yet, for the non-Israelite residents, many of them were put into forced labor, slavery, essentially. And we know this because the writer of Kings, again, is not letting us off the hook here. The writer of Kings uses the Hebrew word for work gang, the very same word that was used in Exodus when referring to how the Pharaoh would organize the Israelites when they too were slaves. It's not a pretty word, and the meaning is clear. So, foreignly sourced materials, additional taxes, conscription and slave labor, and the final critique, and I'm going to say this one, the word we use today is optics. When something doesn't look good, when leaders are doing things, well, this had to have terrible optics because it says right there in Scripture, Solomon's personal royal palace took twice as long to build as the temple, leading readers to assume that maybe the royal palace was twice as big or twice as ostentatious as the temple. So, what exactly were Solomon's priorities here as we take a deeper dive? Well, again, I'll let you decide. Now, controversies aside, when all was said and done, the temple did open to tremendous fanfare, and it served for over 400 years. However, again, man, I'm saying however a lot today. Boy, in those years it was also used to worship Asherah. These are other gods. Baal, the host of heaven, and a solar deity before it was finally cleaned up by a later king. And then, after those 400 years, Nebuchadnezzar II invaded, burned it to the ground, and took large swaths of the Israelites away in bondage to Babylon. Whew, that's a lot of context. What can we learn from this? Now, we've already seen that we should read Scripture more carefully before we idolize our biblical figures, that we need to look at the context all around a verse so we can get the fuller, so that we get the truer meaning. I'm interested in how, when we apply it to our own lives, what it has to say about the fleeting nature of power and wealth. Because, that's still what a lot of society judges people on, right? That's even still how some of our figureheads today orient the world. How powerful are we? How rich are we? King Solomon was large and in charge. There was no doubt about it. Powerful, wealthy, hundreds of wives and concubines, builder of monuments to God. Notice the Scripture says he was never a man after God's own heart, like it says of his father David. Nor is he depicted as a people who loves or is loved by the people he rules. Power and wealth mean very little in the end. So that's one thing that we can see clearly from these scriptures. Another is the impermanence of the earthly. All of that work in the temple, forced to put people into bondage, to spend tremendous amounts of money, reduced to rubble. Was it worth it? Well, maybe. It did serve for 400 years, but it was reduced to rubble. Now, and I'm sure those of you who are part of the Elizabethtown congregation can't read this and not think about the multi-million-dollar project that we are undergoing here in our congregation. We want to create an addition. We want to make a renovation on this 60-year-old building, do some renovations. And so we are asking these questions of ourselves as well. Is it going to be worth it? How do we count the cost, as our brethren forerunners would say? Well, I do find comfort in comparing it to the story of the building of the temple in the sense that, unlike the temple, all contributions are voluntary, that we've met dozens and dozens of times in dozens of different configurations as the congregation to figure out what will be the best to use for our purposes, and that those purposes are all driven by ministry in order to serve other people and to serve more people in the way of peace, service, and openness to all. So, I'm really excited for the additional ministries that we will be able to offer when our renovation and addition finally comes to fruition. And it is still under the works, believe me. No ground has been broken, but the architect is still doing what the architect and his team need to do before we put it out for bid and do those next steps. So, I've also been thinking about how buildings come and go, but also how they're important symbolically and functionally. It's hard to imagine a people of faith these days, or even those days, hard to imagine people of faith organizing, serving, and sharing who they are to the world without a building. Now, I'm not saying it has to happen that way, but that's mostly what we see, right? And it's also interesting, notable, that after Solomon's temple was destroyed, people got sent, carried away in bondage. When they came back from Babylon, one of the very first things they did was to start to rebuild the temple. It was important. It's important symbolically. It's important in terms of functionality. Buildings aren't everything, but they are something. Well, there's many more things that we could ask here today, many more things we could learn, and I'm curious. One of the things I love about being able to do worship this way with people online is that there can actually be some dialogue. Now, I won't be able to read it, but I would encourage you, as you hear some of this context, what are the things that you think about as you think about the morals from listening to the context around the building of that first temple? As you hear about people being taken away, brought back, and then rebuilding the temple, as we think about what it means to be the church, both in building and in personhood today. Go ahead and write that in. Think about that. And let the rest of us think about what you're thinking about too. It's a real upside of online worship. Well, I want to end with this. We see that temples come and go. We see that when they're done right, they help us serve other people. They draw us closer to God in worship and practice. But we are also wise to remember that what actually lasts is not the building, but is the faith. Buildings serve the faith that we have in God, our principles, who we are, what we're made of, and how we follow God. They, at their best, help us define with courage who God is creating us to be, no matter what the world throws our way. And so I couldn't think of any better way to end this sermon with words that you just heard from Anna DeGood. Anna, who was raised in this congregation, who knows who we are, knows what it's like to be part of this congregation. And so I'm going to reread Anna's words as food for thought as we end. She says, "I'm just as overwhelmed and anxious about what the future holds for our country and our future as everyone else is. And it's easy to lose faith," she says. "But if there's anything I've learned from this church and its members, is that there is hope for what comes next. Over the years, I've watched you take in those who need help, befriend those who don't share your opinions, and challenge when it's clear that something needs to be challenged. You don't do it for recognition or power. You do it because of love. Because you love all people of every color and economic status and belief. You've changed my life because of this, by showing me how to love and ask questions and open my eyes to what's going on around me. You've shown me that there's always another way, and I'm endlessly thankful for that. And it goes on. I know that life is only going to get crazier. It's hard to come to terms with the world the way it stands. It's scary, but I know things are going to get better. Because of you, I know there are good people out there. I've seen it every Sunday when I go to church. Because of you, I know that love will find a way, and we will figure out a way to move forward. Thank you for your wisdom, Anna. Friends, I hope those words sink in. Because of the congregation, not the building, we reach out in hope to everybody around us, and we will find a way.